Did you see the employment tribunal case where an employee called her boss a dickhead? He sacked her and she won the case and tens of thousands of pounds. Now, I really want to talk about that case, but maybe not for the reasons that you're expecting. Because this case is way more interesting than the word dickhead and whether or not somebody should have used it. This case is really about fabricated documents, faking an insolvency, bullying using the courts, and what people can learn about what to do when employers lie. So let's talk about that comment and then talk about the really interesting stuff. So all of this happened in a performance meeting. The employee had been there for over 2 years, and for the first time, the employer had said that they weren't happy with the employee's performance, and she said that the conversation was quite heated. She became upset, and the employer came and kind of put their hands on her desk and said, "How do we sort this out?" And she half jokingly said, "Well, I would have left earlier if it hadn't been for you two dickheads," referring to the two other people in the meeting. Now, according to her, that sent off the employer, who got really angry and sacked her on the spot. Now, for reasons that we will come back to later, the judge believed her account of this situation and basically assessed that that was not a fair dismissal. And that's because once you've worked at a company for over 2 years, you can only be fairly dismissed if they have a good reason and they follow a fair process. So the employer had every right to be upset about this, but they needed to follow a fair process. For example, give a verbal warning, and then she would need to do something like that again in order to be able to sack her, because this didn't come to the level of a gross misconduct. It was a one-off incident. There was no pattern of behavior, and that's why the dismissal was unfair. I could make a whole video about how the press seems to love these stories where they take something that is seemingly outrageous and then they're like, look, employees can get away with anything, and it's just that the employer didn't follow the process. But I have a more interesting topic for you, and that is fabricating evidence. So the really interesting thing that happened here was all of the sudden, after all of the evidence had been exchanged for this case, the employer rocked up with a different account of events, a PDF that no one had seen before. And that account of events painted the claimant in a very bad light and said that off the bat she was swearing and screaming and everything was terrible. And the two employers in that meeting, a husband and wife, they had this cockamamie story about how this evidence was typed up, but then handwritten, but then typed up later. And they also had a cockamamie story as to why this wasn't actually included in the evidence bundle that was originally produced. They also couldn't provide any metadata to show how any of this document had been produced before right then and there. And so the judge rightfully said, look, I don't believe this. You have no evidence to show that this isn't something you just made up right now, so I'm going to go with the claimant's version of events. But the story doesn't stop there. Because in the tribunal, if one party essentially takes the piss and really acts out of order, the other party can say, you know what, I think you should have to pay my legal fees. Now, this only happens in exceptional circumstances, but apparently in this case, the circumstances were exceptional. So the employee did what they were supposed to do. They sent them a letter saying, look, if you're not willing to settle with me and you're not willing to drop this, I think that you are behaving in a vexatious way, and so I am going to seek costs. I'm going to seek my legal costs to be paid by you. And the employer ignored it. And then when the employer pulled this potentially fabricated document stunt, that gave the claimant even more ammunition to say, Judge, now that I've won, please award me these costs. But the employer, they seemed to just wanted to dig their grave even further. Because once the claimant had won the case and the employer was told you need to pay them, they then faked an insolvency in order to try to get out of paying them. They didn't actually go insolvent. They just turned off the domain, made all the emails bounce back, and tried to fake an insolvency, despite the fact the company's accounts showed that they had plenty of money in the bank to actually pay these bills. And that is where the story ends. A story of an employer who got caught out, realized that they might not win, probably fabricated a document to try and make themselves win, and then when that didn't work and got them into even more hot water, kept digging instead of just stopping. And there is so much useful information in these two documents about how the court thinks about fabricated evidence, how they take two different accounts of the same situation and weigh them up, how costs really work in the tribunal and how a judge will decide if costs should be paid. Like, there's so much good stuff here for people who are working through the system themselves or thinking about it and want to understand how it would work. And all of that is way more interesting than asking whether or not a woman gets to call her bosses a dickhead when they try to sack her.